And I've got to ask you a question. It's timing right. I mean, you've been asked this question hundreds of times, thousands of times, maybe more than that. Your books are very cinematic. And with The Walking Dead announced yesterday that it's ending after this next series,
Right.
you probably know. I know you're probably a fan of The Walking Dead.
I kind of fell out of love with it around season 7 or 8, but the early parts very
well,
much.
I did. Then I got back into it. I've noticed, and it got better. So I'm trying to get back to it. Honestly, it's got better, and
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
but people always ask you about your work, turning it into a film or a TV series. And the timing obviously is right because Game of Thrones is done and dusted. Walking Dead will be dead. I'll say dead and buried. That's a stupid pun to use, but you know what I mean.
Shambling off, rotting into the distance.
Yeah, I had to have that one. So yeah, yours is better than mine. But you know what I mean? Do you think it will happen in the next foreseeable? Because maybe you can't say, but because they are cinematic. Even when I read your first book 14 years ago, I could see it as a film. I know your background before that was in film and TV, right? And I knew that, but it's not happened yet. But do you think maybe now is the time that you can sort of announce to the world, not to me, but obviously on your own platform?
Well, it would be great. I think sometimes we're guilty a little bit as writers of feeling like that's the sort of seal of success. Have you had the film made? Have you had the TV made? And that shouldn't be the be all and end all. But of course, it is a really important thing, and it would be fantastic for it to happen, no doubt. It has been kind of around the block a couple of times, and there's people that I work with closely in Hollywood, LA, whatever. And hopefully it will at some point happen. They're just the timescales are long, and the kind of convergence of different things has to be right. And there's always an element of luck involved. So I'm always hopeful something will happen, and I hope that it will, but at the same time, the chances of any individual thing coming off are always long. So you just never know, and you can't count on anything really in that world. It's just a very different way of doing things, and the timescales are massive. So hopefully, fingers crossed, yes, but who can say?
And there's lots of hoops to jump through, isn't there? I know we're making a film. It's not just one person says it. You've got a massive amount of people you've got to sort of get it through.
Absolutely, and you can have a yes 5 times, and then a no the 6th time, and that's it. Then it's got to be yes all the way till you're actually on set doing it. So there are many stages at which one can, many hurdles at which one can fall.
Okay, no, thanks for that. I've been wanting to ask you, but I know other people I speak to on the fandoms, they always say, I'm going to speak to you, so they want to ask the questions. So
and the other thing is there's not a lot to be gained from talking about it until there's definitely something going. Is kind of the experience I've had, because it only increases the amount of attention and excitement and so on. And then when things go away, people are disappointed and annoyed, and it's doubly disappointing and annoying for everyone. So it's better just to pretend it never is going to happen until the actors actually arrive. On set.
And Joe's sitting there looking at them, walking at and then all the gear and everything. I've got this question with the books and the new books, the trilogy. They set about 15 years after the last one. Is that right? Is it about 15 years? Period.
So the 3 standalone books are set over the course of about 10 or 15 years after the first trilogy. The second trilogy about 10 or 15 years after that. So the trilogies are kind of 30 years apart, a generation apart, if you like. And then the 3 standalones sort of fill in the gap in between.
Why is that conscious? I mean, why did you sort of stick to that? Going from the first trilogy to the standalones to down with this trilogy. Why the time period?
I don't know exactly why. It just that was what felt right for each book in a way. I suppose for Best Served Cold, it was quite separated from the setting and the characters of the first book. It had characters in common who kind of appear throughout it, but most of the cast was new, and it was in a place we hadn't really visited before. And so it just felt natural to set it a few years later, so that characters that I wanted to use were still recognizable, even if their lives had developed a little bit in the meantime.
Yeah.
And, you know, the world, it kind of developed the world and moved things on a little bit. And so then once that precedent was established, it kind of felt natural to move it 5 years on each time. And that meant that, you know, characters who'd been mid-30s in the first book were maybe 50 now.
Yeah.
And so it shifted things gradually enough, but also meant they were changed new people by the time you got to some of those later books. And then I suppose, you know, the thing I really wanted to do with this new series was to follow a new generation of characters, some of whom were the kind of proteges or the children of people from the previous book.
Yeah.
And so it was natural to move it on a generation's time, kind of 25 or 30 years. And I suppose that gave long enough for the world to have developed. I mean, it's a little bit of a sleight of hand because the world's obviously shifted into quite an early industrial period.
Yeah.
So you know, maybe that was 60 or 70 years in our world, kind of condensed down. But there's no point doing fantasy if you can't just do whatever you like with the world, right?
It's true. It's true. And you just touched on it now when you say you've got some of the kids of other characters before. And obviously in real life, you know, like my daughter's got traits of me, traits of my wife. Maybe your kids have got traits of you and your wife. When it comes to the characters, and like I said, the new characters in this new trilogy, I know so book 2 is out, but book 3 will be out maybe next year, hopefully. Yeah. How did you sort of balance the traits between, say, the father or the mother, 20 who it was, like Goku or whatever, you know? How did you sort of, you know, use elements of, say, the father's, you know, character into the child? And do you know what I mean? How do you sort of get that balance?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I wasn't trying to, you know, think in a genetic sense what is drawn from the mother and what from the father, because I'm not sure that children are necessarily like that. You know, they're their own people, while you still see glimpses of the parent in you know, certain qualities that they have and so on. They're also influenced by their, you know, the role they fit into in society. And so I suppose the other parent is the world and the changing world and the way they fit into that. So a character like Savine, for instance, has two important and influential parents that we know from previous books and have very strong and, you know, flawed personalities as well. There's elements of both those people in her, but at the same time, she's a product of the world and the role she's trying to take in this very changed world, an investor and a kind of industrialist and someone who's obsessed by progress and very driven to succeed. And so I suppose she kind of does develop naturally out of the parents, but then, you know, a character like Leo is absolutely unlike his mother. You know, he's almost defined by his exact oppositeness from his mother. You know, he's like his father in the sense that he's a kind of quite a bluff, honest, good-natured sort of guy.
Yeah.
But he's also got this slightly reckless, slightly ambitious streak. And then his mother's very calculating, very patient. And so that relationship is a kind of push-pull of her always wanting to try and rein him in and keep him safe. Yeah. You know, and also in a way she infantilizes him as well because she wants to keep him safe and keep him a child and not let him grow up and take control of his own life. So I suppose, you know, all kinds of different things develop in the sort of drama you're trying to get out of the characters, you know, and you want a good variety of relationships between the people, of likes and dislikes, of kind of similarities and dissimilarities that are what make the different relationships interesting. But it is certainly a book in which, or a series in which, the characters are very much to begin with in the shadow of their parents, and the parents are very present. Yeah. You know, the four central cast all have a parent who's familiar from the previous books and reasonably well known. So they're very much in the shadow of those people, but you also need them to kind of step out of the shadow. And I think in this second book they do, you know, some of the parents disappear in one way or another, and others kind of step back into the background, and it becomes much more the story of this current generation, which I think you've got to do. You don't want to be too trapped in nostalgia for the previous thing. You've got to try and be moving forward.
Do you find it difficult, though, writing about, you know, still on the same sort of question about the kids of? Do you find it difficult writing when it comes to, because I know, like, if you see a new character, you know, no family connection, whatever, you can sort of just go off and, you know, and create this person. But when you've got to write about, say, the kids or, the son or daughter of such a certain character, do you find that that must be more difficult to write?
I don't know that it is, actually. I think sometimes characters just work very easily. They just happen without much effort. So Clover, for instance, who is kind of a loose cannon, he's not someone we've seen before. He's not particularly bedded into, he knows characters and he's part of the culture, but he's not particularly, he doesn't have living parents, doesn't have children, or, he's not particularly bedded in. He kind of happened just quite naturally and effortlessly, but he's quite he's an additional point of view. He's someone who stands on the side and observes. He's not very deeply entangled into what's going on. So with those 4 central characters, they are all very much part of their culture and part of their families, part of the society that they're inhabiting. And so I found it kind of helpful to have the parents around and the defined culture. And although I wasn't necessarily sitting down and saying, well, Glokta's very ambitious, therefore his daughter will be ambitious, but her mother has a cutting sense of humour, therefore she will have a cutting sense of humour. I'm not doing that so much, but I think instinctively and in scenes between her and the parents, because you know those people well and you've worked with them before and you can sort of effortlessly feel what they'd say or how they'd act in a certain situation. For me, that actually makes it easier to write a scene than when you've got to kind of come up with new people straight away. And obviously, you still have to refine those scenes and work on them and revise them. And the voice of a character develops over time, I find, and then I've got to go back and apply it throughout. So there's still definitely work to be done. But for me, it just helps having, that history and that background you can draw on. The difficulty is you've got to keep everything straight. Yeah. You've got to remember who knows who and who met who when and what their relationships were and what happened. And that can be, obviously with every additional book you write, there's more massive stuff you've got to keep straight and remember, which is its own kind of challenge. But generally, it helps a lot to have those things to draw on and all those characters to kind of pull back into the story now or then whenever you need a new face. It's usually, you can always find an old face that will fit. And I think that helps to create the texture and the tapestry of the world, make it feel coherent.
Okay. One question I've always wanted to ask you is, when you wrote the first one, obviously you wrote this trilogy now, did you write, let's go into the first one, the first trilogy you did, obviously The Blade itself and Before They're Hanged in the last book, Last Argument of Kings, but did you write them all as a one, or did you sort of write one and then you left it and then you wrote the next one, or just because obviously I know the arc's there and the trilogy was there, but did you sort of write it the first book and then have the second book sort of semi-written and then maybe tinker with it once The Blade came out, or did you just have it all written in a one and then just tinker with the second books when the first one was out?
I wrote the first one. It was always conceived of as a trilogy.
Yeah, okay.
But I wrote the first, and that obviously took 3 or 4 years to do because I was, writing quite slowly and experimenting a lot and going over things a lot. But I thought, I need to see if I can get any interest in this, before committing another 5 or 6 years to it or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
And so I started sending out that first book to publishers or to agents first, and kind of receiving a few knockbacks early on, and was writing the second book at that time. So I was halfway through the second book when I got an offer, and then the book wouldn't have been published for another year and a half anyway. Yeah. So I was halfway through the second book when the first deal was signed, and then I think I was halfway through the third book even, or just starting the third book when the first was published.
Right.
So they were kind of written separately, and I think it does show that in hindsight. The first book's quite episodic and doesn't necessarily feel like the plot gets going, which has a sort of charm in a way. But if I was writing it now, I think it would feel a lot more there'd be a lot more narrative drive to that first book than there is as it stands. But I was lucky in that by the time the first book was published, into the third, so I knew exactly where I was going.
Yeah.
And I could revise the first book in the knowledge of how the shape of the whole trilogy would be. And so I felt like it was essential to do that with this new trilogy as well, and to write it. What I did was write a quite a loose first draft of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Before and that I think was vital to do, both in terms of getting the first book as good as I could, making the whole thing as coherent as possible, but also being able to put them out relatively regularly on a schedule that kind of made sense for the books, rather than just throwing them out there when they were done.
Do you? It sounds like you're a bit critical of your first book. Then is that? Would you say that, or a bit self-critical about some of the narrative? Or
I mean, I think I am. On the one hand, I'm fiercely proud of everything that I've done. I think they're amazing.
Well, they are.
But definitely, there's things I'd do differently. Funnily enough, I mean, if I pick the old ones up and read them, generally I'm always kind of pleasantly surprised, or at least the feeling is more, I used to be quite good at this, than it is, I used to be quite bad at this.
Okay.
The worry's more, is my next book also going to work, rather than, oh dear, this is embarrassing. So generally I'm pretty pleased with it, but I think there's certainly, in terms of narrative and structure, there's things I'd do very differently to what I did then. I don't think I was really thinking in those terms. I was really just presenting characters and scenes and experimenting with them, especially early on, before I'd really planned anything or thought about the structure of the whole thing, and giving characters stuff to do within a few chapters, rather than an actual arc and an actual plot that ran throughout.
Yeah.
Sowing seeds. I mean, I like the way that it kind of comes together and coalesces out of a mass of apparently sort of unrelated stuff. And that's something I sort of wanted to do from the start. But I definitely, I'd cut parts of it, and I'd write bits of it differently if I was doing it new. So I'm not kind of embarrassed about it, but at the same time, I'm conscious of what could be improved, and I think a fair bit that could be. But at the same time, I do think, as is often the case with new writers and first books, there's a kind of exuberance to that first book, and a new set of ideas and a voice to it that I'm always trying to recapture. And perhaps you never quite can. You sort of compensate with a bit of craft and a bit of learning and a bit of experience for the kind of spark of originality that you can never quite get back. You use up 20 or 30 years of life experience and reading and influences in that first book in a big kind of bonfire, and then when you've got to write books, on a schedule with some level of expectation, it's a very different experience. So mixed feelings about it, as always. I mean, it's always difficult as well, because when you write a big long series, as I have, or a set of books in the same world, that first book is generally the gateway. So people will tend to pick that book up first, and I think some will bounce off it because it's not as well written and as well structured as later stuff. But I still think, there are obviously plenty of people who've enjoyed it and it's worked for. So
worked for me.
Nothing will ever be loved by everyone.
You
can please some of the people some of the time, and so on. And it's worked pretty well, so you can't complain.
Oh, exactly. We're here now. We're talking, and you've done how many books? And how many more to do as well?
Well, this is the horrifying thing, isn't it? I mean, that's what happened when I was writing the third book. You never look past finishing a book, let alone finishing a trilogy. And I was writing that third book, and my editor said, "So what are you doing next?" And I had this horrible realization: oh God, this isn't it. This isn't the end. I might have to write 30 books in a career, 40 books.
Yeah.
See it all stretching ahead of you and think, Christ,